Hello and welcome to the 31st edition of the GreenWave podcast by SYNI International. I'm SYNI, your host, and we're launching into our series of mini-pods until the end of August, shorter, more focused episodes intended to match the altered attention spans of our summertime listeners. Today's topic is the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, better known to its friends as the HLPF. Specifically, we're diving into the launch of the Climate and SDG Synergy Solutions reports and the wider signals sent at last week's forum in New York. If you missed it, think of this as your guided tour of what was said, what was meant, and what might happen next. The meeting took place in rainy Manhattan, which felt oddly appropriate. The world, it seems, is always trying to dampen the mood when we talk about aligning climate and development. But inside the United Nations headquarters, there was a moment of clarity and, dare I say it, even momentum. The special event on Climate and SDG Synergy Solutions was convened as a side event, but don't let the label fool you. This wasn't a footnote, it was a bellwether. The kind of moment that hints at the architecture of what comes next, if, of course, we can get out of our own way. At the centre of the session were two new reports, jointly issued by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs and the UNFCCC Secretariat. These were not the usual UN wallpaper. They mapped practical pathways to accelerate climate action and SDG delivery at the same time, rather than treating them as parallel tracks or, worse, opposing agendas. Because let's face it, that split-brain approach has led us down the path of shiny climate announcements that fail to address poverty and development finance strategies that forget the planet is on fire. The key idea here was synergy, not in the sense of our company's name, but as a recognition that if we do this right, progress on climate accelerates development, and vice versa. It's the difference between two horses pulling in opposite directions and a team pulling the same cart. The synergy approach means, for instance, that investment in clean cooking technologies isn't just about reducing emissions. It's also about reducing household air pollution, saving domestic work hours each day, and keeping forests intact. One intervention, multiple wins. This is not a new idea in theory. It has been written into policy documents since the ink was still wet on the Paris Agreement. But this year's reports, and the event launching them, pushed the idea forward with the sharp edge of data and case studies. Not just theory, actual examples. Cambodia was cited for integrating its long-term strategy for carbon neutrality with its national development plans. Kenya's climate-smart agriculture initiatives were presented as a case study of how rural livelihoods and mitigation can be advanced together. Uruguay's efforts to decarbonize its grid while expanding access to electricity got an honorable mention. These are not perfect models, but they do what most international policy doesn't. They merge goals into one agenda. The opening keynote from UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed struck a tone of polite urgency. She reminded the room that we are halfway through the 2030 agenda timeframe and nowhere near halfway in meeting the targets. The gap is vast and the time is short, but she avoided despair. Instead, she emphasized integration. Quoting the report, she said, "We do not have the luxury of choosing between climate action and sustainable development." That was probably the most understated mic drop of the afternoon. The event also featured remarks from UNFCCC Executive Secretary Simon Steele, who continues to impress with his no-nonsense clarity. He called the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement two sides of the same coin. Then, in case anyone missed the subtext, he reminded delegates that finance is the litmus test of sincerity. No money, no transition, no alignment of financial flows, no synergy. Just the usual pledges with expiry dates longer than a shelf-stable tin of soup. One of the standout moments was the intervention from an African Union Commission representative who pointed out that While global synergy frameworks are fine, real-world integration depends on local systems. Without policy coherence at the national level, these synergies die on arrival. The comment got knowing nods from the delegations of small island states and least developed countries, who have seen more pilot projects than commercial flights. Everyone agreed on the need for capacity support and long-term finance, but the underlying tension remained. Who pays and who decides? This was also where the conversation got a little more grounded. A representative from Colombia made the case for elevating nature-based solutions in these synergy plans. Another from Fiji underlined that resilience, not just mitigation, needs to be built into the very foundation of this integration model. A speaker from Indonesia pushed for more decentralized finance so sub-national actors could move at pace. A chorus of good ideas, if not yet an orchestra. That said, there was an important undercurrent that emerged through the day. The reports didn't just showcase country-level successes, they also mapped out barriers, with a particular focus on institutional silos. Ministries still compete for funding and turf. Climate ministries talk to the outside world, while development ministries stay focused on internal budget processes. The synergy agenda, in other words, requires rewiring the way governments actually work. That's not as glamorous as announcing a new green hydrogen corridor, but it may prove more consequential. The reports also laid out 6 priority areas for synergy acceleration. These included integrated planning, financing mechanisms, nature-based solutions, digital innovation, capacity building, and inclusive governance. A bit of a bingo card, yes, but useful nonetheless. These are familiar concepts, but packaged here with operational recommendations and examples that showed what can happen when they are taken seriously. For example, the report cited the integration of SDGs and climate targets in Rwanda's Vision 2050 plan. It highlighted how Vietnam is aligning its power development plan with its net zero targets. It showed how Barbados is using blue bonds to finance marine resilience while achieving SDG 14 goals. These were not transformative at scale yet, but the pattern was clear. Countries that align their climate and development planning processes are already reaping policy coherence, cost savings, and higher investor confidence. Speaking of investors, the private sector was largely absent from the room, and that was noticeable. There were a few references to the role of blended finance and de-risking instruments, but the conversation was still overwhelmingly public sector driven. That remains a problem. No synergy agenda can work without mobilizing private capital at scale, particularly in adaptation and resilience, where commercial returns are thin but social value is massive. Perhaps the next HLPF will invite someone from a sovereign wealth fund who reads term sheets. Another missing element, though acknowledged in part, was the role of trade policy. One speaker mentioned the risks of climate-aligned trade measures becoming new barriers to development. Carbon border adjustments, green subsidies, and supply chain standards may all be intended to push climate ambition, but they can also reinforce global inequality, if not paired with support for developing countries. It's an open question whether the synergy agenda can handle that complexity, or whether it will retreat into comfortable, technocratic silos. Still, there was optimism, or at least a performative version of it. The delegates posed for photos with the synergy reports, like they were holding blueprints to a saner world. And, in a sense, they might be. The test will come in whether these reports are downloaded, read, and implemented, or whether they join the long list of worthy PDFs that haunt hard drives and diplomatic briefcases. The event closed with a moderated dialogue that asked, somewhat audaciously, what a true synergy-led global policy regime would look like. There were calls for cross-ministerial task forces, for mandatory sustainability impact assessments, for national development plans to include climate stress tests. A few brave souls even proposed annual synergy audits, the policy equivalent of checking if your two horses are still pulling in the same direction. Outside the room, however, the usual circus of bilateral meetings and press briefings continued. It's easy to get lost in the echo chamber of international diplomacy, but this particular session did seem to offer a glimpse of a pathway that is both necessary and increasingly inevitable. The real question is whether political will and institutional capacity will follow. In the end, the HLPF event offered more than rhetoric. It showed that there is a growing constituency for integration, a community of practice forming around the idea that we cannot afford to solve climate and development separately. The Synergy reports offer a toolkit, not a silver bullet. But if enough governments, institutions, and communities use them well, they might just help close the gap between the world we have and the one we keep promising. Well, that's a wrap on our 31st GreenWave podcast episode. We appreciate you sharing your time. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM, so feel free to follow the pod and share with friends. We'd love if you would leave a review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.